This video is brought to you by Nebula. When the war began, Putin's favourite mercenary outfit, the Wagner Group, were touted as Russia's secret weapon. Their brutality in Syria, Libya and the Central African Republic had earned them a reputation as an effective fighting force, and despite a slow start to the war, in the last few months, Wagner's ruthless tactics, including so-called human wave attacks, have allowed them to make slow but steady progress in Bakhmut. However, Wagner's success in Bakhmut, and Yevgeny Prigozhin's habit of bragging about it, has strained relations between Wagner and the wider Russian army. For the last few weeks, the Wagner Group has repeatedly accused the Russian High Command of withholding ammunition from Wagner, which might be the main reason Bakhmut is still in Ukrainian hands. Tensions hit a new high yesterday when Prighozin literally threatened to withdraw from Bakhmut if he didn't get more support from the Russian army. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this new tension within the Russian army, why it's been great news for the Ukrainians on the battlefield, especially around Bakhmut, and why this is really quite bad news for Putin. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about the Wagner Group and the Kremlin's wider affinity towards private military outfits. In the last decade or so, Russia has developed a habit of using private or paramilitary groups to do its bidding. These include the Wagner Group, led by close Putin ally Yevgeny Prighozin, Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechen mercenaries, usually known as Kadyrovites, or the DPR and LPR militias, which have received copious support from the Russian military. Russia uses these groups because they're only semi-accountable to the Russian state, which means they can be brutally effective while providing Putin and the Kremlin with a degree of plausible deniability. Essentially, these groups can do terrible things during the war, and the Kremlin can just say, this isn't the Russian army, so we're not responsible. Even though these paramilitary groups are fighting on the same side as the Russians and probably receiving orders from Russian command. These groups also allow the Kremlin to cover up the true cost of the war, because deaths and military expenditure in these groups don't show up on official statistics, even if they're indirectly funded by the Kremlin. This arrangement worked well until January, when Wagner took Soledar, a small suburb to the north of Bakhmut. This advance was followed by a series of triumphant announcements on pro-Wagner Telegram channels, and Wagner was even congratulated by the Russian Ministry of Defense, who had previously refrained from acknowledging the group. Yevgeny Prighozin, the leader of the Wagner Group, responded to this by posting a video to Telegram where he essentially implied that Wagner was more effective than the Russian army, and that they didn't need their support. Wagner then mocked the Russian army's failed offensive around Vuhledar and suggested that the assault was an attempt to take attention away from the Wagner Group's successes around Soledar. In retaliation, the Russian army stopped supplying ammunition to Wagner and banned Wagner from recruiting convicts from penal colonies, which is what's allowed Wagner to use their human wave tactics. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down too well with Prighozin, who started issuing daily diatribes against the Russian Defense Ministry. Prighozin even released a video of Wagner troops shooting at photos of two Russian army generals and calling them a homophobic slur. Since then, Wagner and the Russian army have been stuck in a perpetual loop. The Russian army withholds ammunition, Prighozin complains publicly, and then the Russian army restores supplies. Wagner makes gains, Prighozin brags about Wagner being better than the Russian army, and the Russian army withhold ammunition again. Anyway, the spat spilled over into a personal feud between Prighozin and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who has apparently deployed his own private military company called Patriot PMC to compete with Wagner in Donbass. Earlier this year, Prighozin accused him of, quote, treason for apparently trying to destroy Wagner and threatened to sledgehammer his son-in-law Alexei Stolyarov for liking an anti-war post on Instagram. In March, Prighozin went a step further when he seemed to imply that he wanted Wagner to be independent from the Russian army, to become, quote, an army with an ideology. Prighozin then published a letter to Shoigu asking for more ammunition, and in mid-April, he published an essay titled Only an Honest Fight, No Negotiations, where he claimed that, quote, the deep state, internal enemies and bureaucrats, i.e. Shoigu, were hindering the war effort. This is a recurring theme among more hawkish Russian nationalists, who think that the Kremlin have actually been too restrained in how they've prosecuted the war so far, and are always calling for Putin and Shoigu to escalate. Tension boiled over at the end of April when Prighozin published a video on Wagner's Grey Zone Telegram channel warning that, unless Wagner got more ammunition, they would have to fully withdraw from Bakhmut, and implicitly accused Shoigu of lying to the Russian public. This comes a month after Prighozin announced that Wagner would be redirecting some of their resources towards Africa because they weren't getting enough support in Ukraine. Presumably, this didn't happen, because on Thursday, Prighozin released another furious video in front of a whole load of corpses where he again demanded ammunition, called Shoigu a whole load of expletives, and warned that Wagner would withdraw from Bakhmut after Putin's victory parade on May the 9th. So you get the idea. Relations between Wagner and the wider Russian army are at an all-time low. In the past few weeks, Prighozin has announced his intention to turn Wagner into an army with an ideology independent of the Russian army, attack Russia's so-called deep state, and threaten to withdraw from Bakhmut. So what happens next? Could Wagner really ditch the Russian army? Well, as we see it, it all depends on what happens in Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians can hold out for a bit longer, or at least until May the 9th, which seems doable given Wagner's ammunition struggles, then we should expect relations between Wagner and the Russian army to deteriorate further. Prighozin will blame Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense for not providing Wagner with sufficient support, and Shoigu will probably argue that it's because Wagner aren't as effective as they claim to be. More broadly, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful, we should expect an uptick in tensions between Prighozin and Shoigu, as they jostle to blame each other for the Russian army's failings. On the other hand, if Shoigu relents and Wagner takes Bakhmut in the coming days, we might get some bravado from Prighozin, but the current tensions should calm it down a bit. If you made it this far, you'll definitely enjoy the Modern Conflict series. That's a show made by our friends over at Real Life Law, where they break down recent conflicts from around the world, including the Ethiopian civil war and the war in Ukraine, which we've discussed a bunch before in TLDR's videos, as well as things like the US's invasion of Afghanistan and the Turkey-Greek Cold War. It's an incredible series, and it's only available on our streaming service, Nebula. You'll find a bunch of TLDR stuff on Nebula too. Every weekday we post an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, exclusively on Nebula, giving you bonus discussions and explainers. On Sundays we release our show This Week in Parliament, which summarises the week's goings-on in Westminster, only on Nebula. Throughout the week we released videos earlier on Nebula than on YouTube. Every video on Nebula is ad-free, which means that this isn't even here. And most importantly, signing up to Nebula is the best way to support TLDR and all the creators building the platform. It's also super cheap, just a couple of pounds a month. So if you want all of that incredible stuff, then please do sign up using the link in the description.